One of those who viewed my video on Metroland has replied to me that he thinks that I've got the area wrong. He thinks that Metroland begins at Harrow on the Hill and goes northwards up to Amersham. I use the definition taken by John Betjeman. I may not like the Betjeman documentary on Metroland very much, but I started off in the same place as him at Baker Street. In fact, there's a third argument, which is that we're both wrong and that the real Metroland is the original route of the Metropolitan Railway that ran and still runs from Paddington up to Farringdon, now as part of the Hammersmith and City line. Let's have a look at all these three arguments. The north of Harrow on the Hill argument goes like this. Well, I think it does. Harrow is the first real town as you go north along the Metropolitan Line that existed without the railway line. Now, Wembley can claim to be mentioned in a charter in the 9th century, but it wasn't a real place until the railway came through it in the 19th century. 1894, Wembley Park Station opened. There are other train stations in the area, and that led to the deruralization of the area. It had been largely countryside with a bit of park and a manor house and not a lot else. But Harrow definitely existed. It's in the Domesday Book using its old Anglo-Saxon name of Herga. On one side of it, Harrow School, where Winston Churchill studied, and many others before and since, creates its own little village. Harrow on the Hill is actually the wrong name for the station. The station should be Harrow at the bottom of the hill, because that's where it's located. And on the other side of Harrow on the Hill station is the real town of Harrow, developed in relatively modern times as an attempt to create a real city or town as you go out of London. But it's Harrow, whatever way you look at it, is a place of its own, with its own claim to fame. And as you push further northwards, you come to places like Ruislip, which is also in the Domesday Book, and Pinner, which claims, based on its original name of Pinora, to date back to the 9th century, although having spent much of my teenage years there, I'm not actually convinced that's really true. At the very least, Pinner definitely dates back to the 13th century. It has a church in its high street to prove it, more or less. The question then is Metroland all about the villages on the edges of London that were linked up to London by the development of the Metropolitan Railway? I'm not sure it really is. My first reaction to this argument was that Preston Road and Northwick Park are the very essence of Metroland. Neither area really exists in that name. Preston Road really is South Kenton or North Wembley, depending on which way you look at it. And Northwick Park is South Kenton. In fact, the station is tucked in behind the big roundabout, which marks the border between the boroughs of Brent and Harrow. In some ways, Northwick Park Station is an easier way to get to Harrow Hill. It's certainly a more scenic way. And these two neighbourhoods would not exist but for the Metropolitan Railway. The same is true of my very first address, which is North Harrow, which I've always thought was the real epitome of Metroland. The railway line runs straight through the middle of the area. In fact, the platforms are positioned on a railway bridge, which can be seen from the main road, from Imperial Drive, as it comes into and meets up with Pinner Road. No, Pinner Road, it's a slightly artificial concept. North Harrow Road doesn't really exist. It doesn't exist at all. In fact, North Harrow is full of these rather strangely named streets after various counties and locations in different parts of Britain, like Northumberland Road, where I first lived, Lancaster Road, and along the Pinner Road between Harrow on the Hill and North Harrow all the turnings, if I remember rightly, are actually the names of counties like Westmoreland Road. North Harrow wouldn't exist but for the railway, and therefore it becomes the essence of Metroland. It does have features which have nothing to do with the railway, like the Yedding Brook, which was essentially our next door neighbour when I was a very small child, but that's about it. So we can agree to disagree about where you position Metroland going northwards. I think, anyway, Wembley Park and Finchley Road are quintessential Metroland locations. Wembley Park, originally named after Wember, don't really know who Wember was or what Wember was, but Lee is the Anglo-Saxon word for a meadow, and that was the original name of the neighbourhood, which is why football fans, when they sing along that they're going to Wembley, don't realise how historically accurate they're being. And Finchley Road, now that is a quintessential Metroland station. There is no Finchley Road neighbourhood. It's technically actually in Swiss Cottage, which strictly speaking is a neighbourhood named after a pub, the Swiss Cottage pub, which is just by the station of that name. There was actually a Metropolitan Line station close by, virtually next to what is currently the Jubilee Line station, which was closed in 1940, in fact. But the essence of Finchley Road is the way in which it splits a whole series of neighbourhoods and acts as a thoroughfare entry point to all of them. You have the Hampstead Village up the hill to the east. You have Swiss Cottage with its very strong psychotherapy tradition and very powerful tradition of welcoming immigrants from Europe, notably, something it shares also with South and West Hampstead. But South Hampstead, which is where my grandfather, my father's father, was born, in Alexandra Road, has always been a more mixed neighbourhood. It has some high quality housing and stuff, and a fairly controversial housing estate. And behind it, West Hampstead is the entry point to Kilburn, a totally different sort of neighbourhood, built originally heavily by Irishmen who came over to help on building sites and also to build the Glasgow to Euston railway line that runs nearby. And Kilburn is now a very multicultural area, very diverse area of its own. So I'm going to stick with my definition. I like the idea that the Metroland begins as you enter suburbia from Baker Street. But there is a completely different argument, actually, and that is that we should really be looking at the original Metropolitan Railway, constructed in 1863. It's the first urban commuter railway line in the world, and it started off at Paddington Station, closely connected to the Great Western Railway, which started from there, and Isambard, Kingdom, Brunel, and all that. Many of the early trains were actually steam trains. Imagine running a steam train through a tunnel. That creates some very unpleasant atmospherics. And very soon they realized that wasn't a terribly good idea and replaced them. Paddington, like all good railway terminuses, has a controversial past, present, and future. Strange, terrible things happen near railway stations, big ones anyway. Edgware Road, the next stop on the line, is curious. First of all, it's confused a generation of underground map readers who've assumed that you can change trains from the Circle Line or the old Metropolitan Line, now the Hammersmith and City Line, onto the Bakerloo Line. The two stations are pretty close together, but there is actually no interchange between the two. But Edgware Road Station is an interchange in another sense. It splits in two the two ends of what are usually known as Little Beirut. To the south in particular, an area with quite a large Arab population. To the north, a more diverse population, considerable number of Muslims, slightly rather poorer neighbourhood, more working class neighbourhood traditionally. The contrast is that to the south you get lots of restaurants, to the north you get lots of fruit barrows, vegetable barrows where you can buy interesting produce on the street. And then, of course, we come to Baker Street itself, which we've spoken about before, the imaginary home of Sherlock Holmes. But Baker Street, of course, is a road, not a location, that runs north-south. And indeed, Sherlock Holmes's address never existed. But for many years, the Abbey National Bank, now Santander, employed a member of staff, so it was said, to answer the mail addressed to Sherlock Holmes, since its premises occupied the space closest to 221B Baker Street. Now the bank building is gone and there's a museum instead. As we push eastwards along what is essentially the ring road, starts being called the Marylebone Road at this point, later becomes the Euston Road, we take the Metropolitan Line up to Great Portland Street, an unusual station, although apparently not unique, in being built on a traffic island. In other words, you have to cross the road to get at it. It's surrounded by roads on all its various sides. I won't say four sides because it's more like a circle than a square. As we move into Euston Road, it's the same road in fact, to go towards Euston Square, we enter into the world of academia. Euston Square's best known association is with University College London, University College Hospital, and until 1907, when it moved to Hampstead, my old school, University College School. These three entities were created by Jeremy Bentham on the basis there should be no bar to people of any race, religion, colour or creed. I don't know if Bentham actually considered ethnicity as such, but he certainly considered religion. He didn't like the way in which British universities at that point required you to be essentially a member of the Church of England in order to graduate. The creation of his godless university triggered a reaction. In fact, the creation of King's College London was a direct response to the godless UCL. But it does have a place in history. When I was a teenager, most of the private schools in London had quotas, percentages of the number of Jewish pupils that could be admitted in each year. I think that would be illegal now. But UCS, University College School, never had such a quota. And that is to its great credit. Euston Square is right by Euston Station. It's about 50 yards walk away. And Euston and King's Cross St Pancras, which is the next stop on the line, have something strangely in common with New York City. Euston was essentially vandalized, the famous arch torn down when they built the modern Euston Station, which is architecturally something of a charm-free zone. The same happened in New York when they did this to Penn Station, wrecked it, created a modern monstrosity. The result on each occasion was the preservation of the other station. So in London, King's Cross St Pancras was hung onto like grim death at one point. In fact, John Betjeman was one of the great advocates of the preservation of King's Cross, particularly St Pancras, which is strictly speaking a separate station and architecturally a good deal more distinguished. In America, in New York, Grand Central Station is our version of St Pancras, and frankly, it's a good deal better looking. It's one of the most stunning buildings, I think, in the world, certainly railway buildings. As we move away from King's Cross, we head past the murky past of Pentonville Prison up towards Farringdon, which is really located in the area of Clerkenwell. Farringdon marks also the passage of the River Fleet. It's a river that started off in Hampstead Heath, still does, by the way, and was probably the last of the open rivers that was covered over because it became something of a sewer. But as you come out of Farringdon station and join Farringdon Road to walk southwards towards Blackfriars Bridge, you are actually walking over the River Fleet. You can sort of tell there must be a river underneath because the Holborn Viaduct doesn't really make sense without it, which is a big bridge over the top of a non-existent water. So that takes us to the end of the Metropolitan Railway as it was originally constructed. It's very noticeable from the pictures, and there are plenty of them, of the original launch party at which a lot of politicians turned up, that Farringdon Station, notwithstanding the building of the extension across the road to cope with the growth of the Thameslink, has actually not changed very much over time. It's also exposed to the sky at certain points, which reveals the old cut and cover method. The cut and cover method, which was just to sort of scrape out the mud, build a tunnel, put the railway down and then put a lid on it, meant that sometimes it wasn't necessary to put a lid on the railway line and people just didn't bother doing that. What it means in practice is you get off a train on the Metropolitan Line in that part of the world and you're fairly close to the street. This can contrast with the situation in lines like the Northern Line, where notably Angel, which is one stop away from King's Cross and Pancras, has the longest escalator in the underground. It's a different world. And in that respect, our original Metropolitan Line is the true Metroland. I leave it to you to work it out. Either way, Metroland is a cultural entity. It may be the area to the north of Harrow. It may be, as John Betjeman and I thought, the area from Baker Street upwards, or it could be the original Metropolitan Line, now part of the Hammersmith and City Line.